Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is David Wood. I'm the executive director here with the Chesapeake Stormwater Network. Thanks for joining for the third of our four summer webinar series webinars. Today, I'm really excited to have Barbara Hopkins with us from the Green Infrastructure Leadership Exchange to talk about a new report that they developed called the State of Public Sector Green Stormwater Infrastructure in 2022. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items and things to get us kicked off. For those of you who didn't hear the announcement, this webinar will be recorded. We try to make the webinars as well as the slide decks available to you all on the archive webinars portion of our website, chesapeakestormwater.net. So if you missed it or you have to hop off early or want to share it with a colleague, you can head over there. It usually takes us a day or two to get it up on the website, but it will live there eventually. We do have a couple of poll questions at the beginning this morning, or I guess this afternoon, to get us started, just to kind of figure out who you are and what's bringing you to today's webinar. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, you can use the Q&A feature in the taskbar or the toolbar. You can also use the chat. You should have the chat enabled as well. So feel free to put your comments and questions in either place. I'd say Q&A is a little easier for me to keep track of when we get to the end, so I'd recommend it, but I also encourage you to interact with each other as well in the chat. And then we do appreciate your feedback. I have a quick evaluation survey that I'll put in the chat at the end today. Before you leave, if you could follow that and fill out the couple of questions. It's only about 4 questions. It should take you less than a minute or two to fill it out, but we do appreciate the feedback. It helps us make our webinars better. All right, so for those of you who are not familiar with the network, here is who we are. We are a 2-person nonprofit organization based in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, just north of Baltimore. We are working really to connect stormwater professionals, provide training, provide resources and webinars, and bring new topics, new science to you all to help you learn, innovate, and grow your programs. So we do some fun stuff. All the resources that we have, for the most part, are free. So sign up if you're not already part of our Stormwater Scoop newsletter and get involved. We have a couple things coming up at CSN as well. The biggest of which is our Chesapeake Urban Stormwater Professionals program, our CUSP program. It says the registration opening soon, but registration is actually now open. This is a free professional training program, sort of like a certificate program, really geared towards audiences that are kind of newer in the stormwater profession, young professionals, students in undergraduate or graduate programs, as well as maybe folks transitioning careers. It's a really good program. It's a 14-course online program, but it's done at your own pace. So if you're interested in this, we cover everything from kind of the basics of runoff and stormwater management, all the way up through, the different practices that you can use to reduce stormwater impacts in your community, and then going through each of the minimum control measures for municipal governments and MS4 permittees to kind of learn best practices for improving their programs. So if it sounds like something of interest to you, growing your community, advancing your career, I encourage you to go over and check that out. It is also a free training program that will kick off this fall. And I mentioned this is the third of our 4 webinars this summer. Our 4th webinar is next Wednesday, August 2nd, at the same time, noon or the lunch hour. We have Dr. Shirley Clark from Penn State Harrisburg joining us to talk about the urban soil conundrum. So she's been doing a lot of work on soil compaction and soil health in urban environments, and she's going to talk a little bit about her research and findings. So if you were not already signed up, again, you can register or RSVP at our website. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a couple of polls for us really quick before we get started. Again, just to kind of figure out who you all are and where you're coming from. So the first one today to get us started is just asking, who you're representing. It helps us kind of understand, as this presentation and these findings are geared a lot towards the public sector. That said, there are implications for everybody. So we want to kind of figure out, are you with a local government or state government, or maybe representing a private sector, NGO, or someone else? If none of these really describe you, let us know in the chat. I'll give about 5 more seconds. Okay, so I'll flip this around. All right, looks like we've got a pretty even spread here. About a third from local government, about a third from the private sector, and then a third kind of a smattering of everybody else. All right, next poll question. We are going to go to poll number, I'm going to call it poll number 3 here, but it's going to be our second one that I'm going to launch. And this is to see how familiar you are with our 2 networks. Barbara and I know both kind of advertised this webinar today. So I wanted to get a sense, how many of you are joining because you are part of CSN's network and are just getting to know the Green Infrastructure Exchange. How many of you kind of know the exchange, but not CSN? And then how many of you are maybe a little bit unsure or know both of us? There are a lot of us capacity building groups, all with the network or some similar set of acronyms in our name. So it's easy to get us mixed up. All right, so I'll go ahead and flip that around. We've got a good mix. A lot of you know CSN, a few of you know both. And then a number of you will probably need a flow chart or a tutorial at some point. So we'll work on that as well. All right, last poll before we get going. We want to ask, let me see, have I? Sorry, there we go. Let's turn that one off. All right, so we're going to launch our last one here. And this is to kind of set the table for our presentation. The state of public sector green stormwater infrastructure is, and this is sort of, cribbing, I guess, from the State of the Union announcements. There's always your headliner, right? It's stronger than ever. It's weaker than it should be. Maybe the state of the public sector GSI is just overwhelming, too much to wrap your head around. It's diversifying in a lot of different ways, maybe. The people, the communities that we're working with, the types of practices and considerations that we're working with, or maybe it's all of the above. I'll give this one 5 more seconds. Right. Flip this one around as well. All right, so about half are a little bit pessimistic here. So, a little bit weaker than it should be. But I also like that it's a little bit all of the above as well. So, a few folks in each answer. All right, well, thank you for sharing all that. That is a good way to kind of get us started. I'm going to stop sharing, and while Barbara pulls up her slides, I'll go ahead and introduce her. So Barbara Hopkins is the executive director of the Green Infrastructure Leadership Exchange, which is a social impact network that seeks to activate local governments and water agencies in the United States and Canada to equitably implement green stormwater infrastructure. Trained as both a lawyer and landscape architect, she previously served for 13 years as the executive director of Neighbor Space in Baltimore County, an urban land trust, and earlier as the vice president for institutional advancement at the Baltimore City Community College. So Barbara, thank you so much for joining us. Happy to have you here. And go ahead and take it away when you are ready.
Great. Well, thank you, David. And let me get to the beginning here. I'm so pleased to be with you today. And I want to thank the Chesapeake Stormwater Network for the opportunity. I've lived in the watershed for most of my life. So let me also say how much I personally appreciate the good work that everyone here is doing. I also want to say hello to exchange members that I see. I know Beth Dutton is one of them. I know there are others. Beth is from Pittsburgh, one of our terrific members, and I saw some other friends from the League of Women Voters in Baltimore County, other Baltimore County folks, including our county executive's wife, and some friends from Corvius, among others that I noticed as I quickly went through the list of attendees. So thank you all for being here and for your interest in this report. So first, a bit about the exchange. We are a collaboration, a network. There's lots of, as David mentioned, adjectives for describing what it is that we do, but in essence, a collaboration among local government stormwater professionals that includes 55 member organizations and 378 individual members across North America. The exchange, as David mentioned, is a social impact network and community of practice that seeks to activate local governments and stormwater agencies in the US and Canada to implement green stormwater infrastructure equitably. Let me break that down just a little bit. So we are this group that's seeking to solve a difficult problem by working together, adapting over time, and generating a sustained flow of impacts. The individuals, of course, are local government, stormwater practitioners, GSI practitioners. The problem is really, how do we utilize GSI to comply with regulatory requirements while also realizing the co-benefits that are going to ameliorate inequities? Our activities are primarily peer learning and a re-grant program. We have 6 peer learning circles that meet monthly, and those circles also receive grant funds to tackle, to hire consultants to tackle particular problems that are of interest to the circle members. We also do training and then evidence building, which this report I'm going to talk about today is an example of. And the overarching impact, hopefully, are innovations that advance GSI practice and help it live up to its promise to both manage stormwater and to improve livability in disadvantaged communities. What do we mean by GSI? Well, in the report, we tell you that we use the EPA definition, which is very long. Starts out with talking about plant and soil systems, but then permeable surfaces, substrates, etc. It's a real mouthful. And as I was talking to a reporter from Governing Magazine about this report, he asked me, well, what would somebody do to explain this to their grandmother? And I said, oh, wow. Well, you know, it starts out with using plants and soils to manage stormwater. That's in places where you have a lot of stormwater, but in places where you don't, you know, there are other measures that are put in place. And to his credit, his explanation, let's see here, difficulty managing the slide. His explanation to the challenge was really to simplify this greatly. Let me figure out what's going on with this slide. And it was simply to say that green stormwater infrastructure systems use plant, soil, stormwater harvest, and other strategies to keep more rain where it falls. So I think that's something that anybody's grandmother could use. It is a challenge, as you'll see in the report, for all of the people that we surveyed to find a good umbrella and a good descriptor for what GSI actually is and isn't. Finally, implementing GSI equitably. What do we mean by that? You know, an equity lens compels us to understand better who benefits from green infrastructure and who is marginalized from these benefits, and also that one's race, wealth, zip code, or other forms of systemically and historically oppressed identities do not define the standards of water, open space, or other green infrastructure benefits. And being cognizant of 4 equity types is really key to equitable implementation. And let me just talk about them briefly. First, there's spatial equity. So that's the where, you know, where is the dis and underinvestment in communities? Then there's identity equity. That's one of the who's. Are communities of traditionally marginalized populations actually receiving GSI benefits? Another who is process. Who has a seat at the table when we're talking about doing these projects? And then finally, who has influence? If you've got a seat at the table, it's for naught if you don't have any influence over the process. This is a topic, this topic of equity, that we've spent most of our 7-year existence thinking and writing about a lot, as you can see from this timeline of equity resources that we've developed. The report I'm going to talk about today is the latest in a series. And you can find all of these on the resources page of our website at giexchange.org/resources. So on to the report. So what I really want to talk about briefly today is the key findings from the first national study of GSI that was developed by public sector stormwater management organizations, an abbreviation or acronym that we use as SMO in the report. So we're talking not just about local governments, but also stormwater authorities across the United States that were our survey respondents. And there is a splash page for this report at www.stateofgsi.org. And on that splash page, you will find a link to the report and also a link to the data that goes along with the report that's in a sortable dashboard. So you can sort of sort by jurisdiction. The idea is that if you're sort of looking to compare yourself to a similar sized jurisdiction across the country, you would be able to do that. First, some brief acknowledgements of the lead author, Greenprint Partners, with whom we have a long partnership, our sponsors, the JPB and Pisces Foundations, and our Sector Diverse Advisory Board that's shown here. The report is also rich with commentary from community members from cities across the country, shown here, including a gentleman from Baltimore. And it was reviewed by a cross-section of practitioners, funders, and researchers. Our three overarching purposes were, first, to understand the state of green infrastructure implementation. Second, to move the industry toward a shared standard for GI that's inclusive of equity. And finally, to offer recommendations for all the sectors, not just local governments, but all the sectors that are seeking to scale GSI that serves communities. So whose story are we telling? Well, let me share a bit about the survey respondents. The survey was taken by 52 public sector stormwater management organizations, serving collectively 13% of the US population. They represent 27 states, a variety of population sizes, team sizes, program lengths, sewer types, etc. And 6, or about 12%, were from the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Our questions to them fell primarily in 4 categories. First, how much GSI are we doing, where, and at what cost? Second, what is driving local governments to implement GSI? What's the why? Third, are we advancing a national standard for GI implementation, including equity? And finally, what levers can local governments pull to create effective GSI programs? We'll cover each of these topics briefly in the slides that follow. So what are we spending? We worked with our survey testers to craft questions about spending that would be simple enough to answer across a very diverse body. So the questions included annual capital spending on stormwater management and GSI, actual O&M spending on GSI, operations and maintenance, and cost per drainage acre or gallon, depending on the unit of measurement used. There were absolutely huge ranges in the answers to each of these questions, owing to the vast variation in the sizes of the jurisdictions that we surveyed, but there was reasonable consistency that GSI is about 10% of stormwater spending. Where are we spending it? Mostly, but not overwhelmingly, on public land. We'll see in a moment that this is driven by levers related to regulation. It's also a little deceiving because not everyone we surveyed measures stormwater management in acres. A small number use gallons, which points to the lack of standardization that currently exists in the field. Next, we will look at 10 common drivers and see how participants rated each driver's importance for building support for GSI within their jurisdiction. So here you see the 10 drivers. And what you also see is that unequivocally, water regulations are the #1 driver for GSI. As Water Now's Cynthia Kohler told us, this is great news. It's a sign of how far we've come to make green infrastructure a legitimate path to regulatory compliance. From another perspective, however, this means we need regulations crafted in a way that allows and requires us to center community, elevate co-benefits, and more. In other words, to implement a national standard for GSI. Are we advancing a national standard, including equity? The Sector Diverse Advisory Committee that steered this work wanted to elevate a new standard for GSI that has the 7 elements shown here: centering community, prioritizing vegetative practices, providing multiple benefits, assessing impact, regular maintenance, regular inspection, and last but certainly not least, putting disadvantaged communities first. This slide looks at all of the factors except the last, which was part of a separate question. The majority prioritize most factors at least sometimes. However, there is significant work needed to prioritize all of these factors as a new standard. On the positive side, more than half of respondents prioritize maintenance, multiple benefits, vegetative practices, and regular inspection most of the time or always. There is significant room for growth, however, when it comes to assessing impact and centering community. With respect to targeting disadvantaged communities and putting them first, we found, unfortunately, that 45% of respondents are unable to estimate the portion of their cumulative GSI funding directed to projects in disadvantaged, socially vulnerable, and/or environmentally vulnerable communities. A final set of questions asked respondents what levers local governments could pull to create effective GSI programs. What can you do to make your GSI, to implement a program and to make it effective? The length of each bar in this slide indicates the number of respondents who use each of the levers. And you can see that they're organized from top to bottom so that you're seeing those who use the greatest use at the top. Green means that the lever is very effective. Blue means it's somewhat effective, and gray, or the darker color, means that it's ineffective. While the levers were rated as somewhat or very effective by most respondents across the board, the data about who's pulling them revealed 3 distinct groupings: people, policies, and emerging practices. The people levers, far and away, are the most used of any here. And they represent the broad cooperation that's needed For almost any government program to be successful, think about it. You need support from elected officials, strong internal senior champions, outreach that builds public support, and cooperation across governmental departments. You can't really get to the next two groups of levers if these aren't in place first. Once you have cooperation, you can think about the next group of more policy-oriented levers. Regulation and enforcement of same, classifying GSI as a capital expense, funding maintenance, the bane of the existence of many of our members, and training staff, doing the kinds of things that our members do in peer learning. Finally, with the people and policy levers in place, you can think about emerging practices like using an asset management system, collecting fees, stormwater fees, for example, retrofit incentive programs, and workforce development. Among the smaller group of stormwater management organizations that use these levers, almost all of them rate them as effective. We also held several roundtables with the audiences to whom the report was targeted to solicit feedback about sector-specific recommendations. Let's look at a few of those. For stormwater management organizations, the data we collected were apples and oranges for the most part. There is really a much greater need for standardization and how we measure, categorize, and define GSI. For the federal government, a new standard is needed that accounts for GSI that is community-driven, multi-benefit, actively monitored, maintained, and researched for its holistic impact. For the private sector, we need them to comply with and even go beyond what regulations require in development projects. For the philanthropic community, we need help for those in the trenches to tell better stories about what GSI can actually accomplish. For national nonprofits like the Exchange, we need to do a much better job than we currently are about advocating for better regulation. If regulation is the driver, then we need to advocate to the federal government to do a better job of including the standards that I talked about earlier. And finally, for community-based organizations, we need to ensure that they are compensated when they work hand in hand with local governments on project implementation. That's what I have, David, and I would be happy to answer questions and would note again that the report is available at the URL shown here, stateofgsi.org, and that there are many other resources available on our website at giexchange.org/resources.
Great, thanks, Barbara. Really appreciate that. As a reminder for folks, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A feature. Barbara, I had one or two that maybe can get us started while we see if other folks want to chime in. The first is just kind of, wondering, now that you've conducted this survey, if you have any plans for kind of the frequency of follow-up surveys to see if there are changes or progress in any of the initiatives that you mentioned.
Yeah, great question, David. We're going to do this on a tri-annual basis. So 2025 will be the next time that we conduct the survey, and we're also using the data to influence our strategic planning on this question of sort of the great need for standardization one of our initiatives next year will be the development of what our members call the playbook, and what I call a framework of GSI practice. It's something that's currently lacking, and hopefully that will help us with some of the standardization that clearly needs to happen.
Great. Yeah, no, that's good to hear. We've been doing a sort of a Chesapeake Bay focused survey, with some different focuses than what you all cover, but we've done it every 2 to 3 years, maybe with a little less stringent regularity, but it's good to kind of be able to see how that changes over time. So looking forward to that. I did, for folks, before you head out today, I did put an evaluation survey link in the chat. If you could, follow that before you head out, and let us know what you thought of today's webinar and any suggestions that you have in the future. Another question that I had for you, Barbara, I was interested in knowing, obviously we have a Chesapeake Bay focused audience here. I was curious if you all had looked into any, regional or geographic differences in some of the findings, if you were able to sort of partition those out, or if you were interested in doing that in the future.
Yeah, for sure. I think, that's one of the challenges of doing a survey like this, is that there are very unique regional differences given, just given that we're working with plants and we're working with climate, and those are variable across the country. And so I think when we do this again, we will be looking to folks like Chesapeake Stormwater Network for input on how we might better, ask questions that will help to ferret out some of those differences, and also to just for your expertise, and to make sure that we're asking some of the things that would help you in your own work.
Great. And I'll do one last question for you before we wrap up, and see if there are any others. You mentioned kind of the value that folks, the respondents, saw in training activities and programs, and I was wondering if either through the report or from your own perspective, and this kind of gets to my own means as a training organization, if there are areas that kind of rose to the top where folks are kind of looking for training or saw the most value in training for their staffs or their programs in terms of effectiveness for improvement. If there anything that kind of jumped out to you?
Yeah, I think that whole levers discussion really lends itself to thinking about training across the board. At the 101 level, I think there are a lot of, where you stand depends on where you sit. There are a lot of smaller organizations who need just the basics, who need the kind of 101 that you are doing so successfully with the CUSP program. And at the higher end of the scale, there's a lot of need for training about how you do asset management well, and about how you get involved in, finding other resources to support this work through the state revolving fund programs, for example, through the implementation of incentive programs, through the implementation of stormwater management fees. How do you do that effectively? And then there's a whole other layer, I think, of training needed on regulation.
Yeah.
And on how you craft effective regulations. So I think if you're a training organization, the world is your apple.
We did have a couple of questions come in through the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and go through some of those. The first question is, what are effective ways for community organizations to engage with their cities or utilities to get more GSI implemented equitably?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would first direct you to our website, to some of the resources that exist in the equity section of the resources page. There's a report that came out right before this State of GSI report was issued, called Community Voices. And I think there's material in there that would be useful to any CBO that's concerned with engaging with local government. Honestly, I think, if you're not having success that, it really does require CBOs working together to get the attention of local governments. And we have a whole lot of resources for local governments on how they can engage. There's a resource on our website called the Equity Guide for GSI Practitioners. And it's not just a guide that is full of theory. There are practical resources about what local governments should do to engage with local community members as they think about the implementation of these projects. So it really is all about, doing as much advocacy as you can with the CBO, but then CBOs actually working with local governments actually working hand in hand, using some of the practices that are in that guide to create effective outreach programs. And I spent about a week in April in Philadelphia. I don't know if we have any representatives from Philadelphia here today, but the resources and the effort that they engage in to work with community as they implement GSI programs in disadvantaged communities is just absolutely amazing. And if there is a local government on the call that's interested in finding a place that's a great model, Philadelphia is a wonderful place to start. That's not too far away from our watershed. Another place is Milwaukee.
Yeah, and a related question, that came in is sort of how do you ensure, whether you are a community organization or probably more acutely a local government, that you're not pushing green stormwater infrastructure on a community that either doesn't want it or doesn't quite understand, what it is and what the benefits could potentially be, as well as the drawbacks, because there are, considerations that they need to take into account as well.
Yeah, I think, community members have to be in the driver's seat. That said, local governments can't do this outreach on a shoestring. That's been done. You can't do this with half a person and $100, right? It takes real money and a real desire to implement GSI equitably and create an effective community outreach program. And in fact, in the Equity Guide, which David has very kindly put in the chat, there are some resources for local governments to actually kind of take a self-test and determine whether or not you have the wherewithal to begin down this road. In the Chesapeake watershed, there is certainly a great need and many opportunities, especially in the county where I live, in Baltimore County, to do a lot more. Let me just emphasize, a lot more than we are currently doing. To work with all the communities who are disadvantaged to implement better stormwater practices, and at the same time, give people what they truly need, and that is more open space. So there has to be, a collective will to go down this road, but the benefits of doing so are enormous.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, from, CSN's perspective and kind of what we talk about, we've really been emphasizing the earlier that you can, meet with and talk with community members in a planning process, the better. And, to Barbara's point, the more, voice that you give the folks in the early decision making, kind of bringing folks along from the start. We've seen pretty successful models that focus on almost a community driven design charrette. You kind of go in with no assumptions, you bring as many folks to the table and show them that they have some voice in that process, and kind of let them map out what they would like, in terms of amenities within their communities. And then you can work with them to figure out how, GSI can fit within the goals that they have for their neighborhoods and their spaces. And I think that has had a lot of success as a model. It does take more resources and more time, and not just at the outset, but all the way through the process. But it's certainly worth it in terms of the long-term investment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that whole chart I showed on levers really bears that out, that, you have to have first the sort of internal cooperation, looking for ways to make budgets go further, right? Not being kind of siloed and thinking about a transportation project as just a transportation project, but we're going to tear things up. There may be opportunities to create GSI and to create some sort of other public benefit as a result. And then, the policy aspects of implementation are also important. Once you have that cooperation, can you put the regulation in place that's actually going to generate some fees and give you some dollars to do this? You really cannot do this effectively from dollars that you collect from taxpayers. You need to have some other source of income. And then finally, can you think about, once these projects are done, and these are sort of the emerging practices, how you create an effective workforce development program to maintain them? I would encourage anyone who might be interested in that to go to Prince George's County, where there is actually a very effective program that's local government is doing in cooperation with nonprofits, and Corvius, who is on the call today. That's just amazing in terms of what they've been able to do, both to create more green stormwater infrastructure, but also to engage people with the aid of CBOs from design through implementation, and then in a workforce development program to maintain it at the end. That's just a win-win-win. And that's kind of, if we do have sort of the vision to do this, that's, I think, what we would hope to have in the end.
You've been making my segues really easy on this, because the other question that we have here is, a report by Brookings came out yesterday that shows that the focus on green jobs is almost entirely lacking in climate action plans for various cities. And so, noting GSI's tie-in, the person with the question was asking if you could speak to or cite any GSI programs or projects that do the green jobs aspect particularly well, if there are any. So you mentioned Prince George's County. I don't know if there are others that you would kind of speak to or recommend.
Yeah, I would go back to Philadelphia, where the local government there works, has a great partnership with a group called Power Corps. And I think Power Corps has its own website. They've been so successful that I think they've gone to other places like Boston. Boston also has a very effective GSI program. It's the only city in the United States that I'm aware of currently where the GSI director is actually a cabinet level member of the mayor's cabinet. Milwaukee also has a couple of effective workforce development programs. Yeah, that would be my top list, my A list.
And then the last question I have here in the Q&A is a little bit more of a nuts and bolts question, and it's about, we use rainwater collection in our community garden. What other GI practices, might make sense or be beneficial in that type of a setting? I don't know if you want to speak to that, or I can also weigh in as well if you.
Yeah, well, why don't you go for it, David?
Yeah, obviously it's going to depend on the specific site that you're in and, the space that you're working with. But, there are certainly options depending on how much room you have at the site. Rainwater collection is a great option for community gardens. You can always, look at things like small rain gardens to try to capture and infiltrate some of your runoffs sort of around the edges of the site in particular. I don't know what kinds of impervious cover you have, in and around the garden, but sometimes just removal and amendment of your compacted soils is another nice place to start. So again, it sort of just depends a little bit on, what your constraints are, where your runoff is coming from and things like that. But there are usually a number of options, kind of small scale, that would work, really well in a community garden type of space without impacting the productivity of your garden. All right. That gets to all of our questions through the Q&A. So I just wanted to, thank you again, Barbara, for joining us and sharing, all of your thoughts and, lessons learned from the survey, as well as sticking around for a little bit of discussion here at the end. I'll just remind folks again, there is an evaluation survey link over in the chat, as well as links to the resources from the GI Exchange, and then a direct link to the equity guide that we referenced in our discussion. So I encourage you all to go and check those out. Don't forget, we will be back next Wednesday at lunch for a discussion with Dr. Shirley Clark on soil health. So, I think that brings us to an end. I'll let you all go 15 minutes to shovel down some lunch before you get back to work at 1 o'clock. All right. Thank you all.
David.
Thank you,
Thank you
Barbara.
all.
And we will talk to you all soon.